Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Joe Patrick on Football, where today we are going to be breaking down the Falcons' Week 3 matchup as they travel up I-85 to Charlotte to play the Carolina Panthers on Sunday. That game kicks off at 1 p.m., so back to the usual start time for the team. But before we get into breaking that game down from both sides of the football for the Falcons, I did just kind of want to opine a little bit on a question I just heard while I was listening to some podcasts on YouTube, which is, by the way, where you can listen to this podcast at the 92.9 The Game YouTube channel, or you can follow us on podcast form. Just search Joe Patrick on Football wherever you get your podcast, and you can follow me on X at JAPatrick200. But I was listening to a segment from the Football 301 podcast, which we've mentioned here before, where I've kind of gone at some of the guys for some of their takes previously, and I thought it was interesting. Well, it's one of those questions that typically gets asked after week 2, especially for 1-1 teams. And the reason I address this is because I respect Nate Tice and Matt Harmon, who are both opining about this. And the question is simply, are you buying or selling the Falcons? And that's a very open-ended question. And so I just kind of wanted to give my opinion on it. By the way, if you were wondering, Nate Tice said he was selling, and Matt Harmon said he was buying. But they obviously had their caveats both on both kind of sides of the scale there. But I think it's obviously a question itself that is open for interpretation, because what does buying mean? What does selling mean? You know, like these are just kind of interpretive questions. To me, it's like, are you buying them as a playoff team? That's the way that I'm taking this question. And I would say that, like, I am on the buying side of it. I kind of have been. Bought into, I think, what this team could be, and generally the probability that they would fulfill that potential of being what I think they could be. But I would say that I don't know if I'm quite buying what this team reflects statistically at this moment. I do think that it's very easy to get caught up in some small sample sizes, some very opponent dependent stats that are accrued. When you're only 2 games into a season, and the Falcons have gone against at least one clearly substandard quarterback in J.J. McCarthy, an offense that is just not fully functioning there in Minnesota, and obviously they're going to Carson Wentz this week as J.J. McCarthy, I believe he's been put on IR. I don't know, don't quote me on that, but obviously going to be out for a little bit with a high ankle sprain apparently. So, but they are obviously able to take advantage, and so for that reason, the Falcons are looking amazing on paper, especially in ways we maybe didn't expect. And what I'm talking about specifically is the Falcons ranking currently second in defensive DVOA right now. We talked earlier this week about where they rank statistically in some of these categories with regards to the pass rush, with regards to the defensive passing EPA per play metrics. They're about, the 5th best defense by a lot of those metrics with regards to sacks and pressures and all those kinds of things. And that's the area of the team where I'm not sold that they're going to finish the season that way. We obviously kind of talked about that a little bit on that particular episode. And if you want more about that, I would just encourage you to go back and find that episode from earlier this week where we kind of go talk about the Falcons by the numbers and where they stand now. But I am buying this team because I don't think that we've even really come close to tapping into the potential for what this offense can be, which is what we talked about on yesterday's podcast. They've shown the different areas of the team that can be functional. They have not shown everything that can be functional in this offense when it comes to them not really having been able to push the ball downfield and complete those successful downfield passes. But we also have evidence that they can do that based upon what they were doing last year. So even if you include those 3 games that Michael Penix played last year, then I think you can see all the different components in the way that this team, this offense at least, can beat opposing defenses. But we haven't really seen in any of these games, I think, that have been played yet, except for maybe the Giants game, which was Michael Penix's first game, but obviously a very weak opponent there. We haven't really seen the offense really click in all phases at the same time. And it's not to say that you're going to be able to run for 200 yards and throw for 300 yards or whatever in the same game. I'm not saying that, but in terms of just presenting the threat and showing effectiveness in the run game, in the downfield passing game, in the time of possession, keeping the chains moving, short passing game, quick game type of stuff. I don't know if we've seen quite all of that in one game. Obviously, the Panthers game that ended last season was probably the best this offense has looked, just purely in terms of the passing game in particular, considering that game was such a shootout. But we haven't seen that this year, and they haven't really. I mean, I guess you could say they needed it in week 1 against the Bucs, especially toward the end, but still, Michael Penix was able to take what was given to him, as we talked about, and do pretty well. But I think that this could be a week where we do start to see at least some more of those elements of what this Falcons offense needs to be successful start to come to fruition against an opponent that seems very gettable in the Carolina Panthers, who had a lot of promise coming into the season, and I would say I was actually on the more promising side of it for the Panthers and Bryce Young and everything, but obviously they've gotten off to a really, really rough start. They are looking tough, not tough for them. I mean, rough. They look like they're in rough shape. So let's start to get into this game a little bit. First of all, I just want to kind of break down, like, Atlanta's 5.5-point favorites coming into this one. Based upon the over-under, the implied score would put the Falcons at about 24, 25 points. Obviously, you're very rarely going to score 25 points, or some of these numbers you're just not going to score, but this is just implied odds. 24 to 25 points for the Falcons, so kind of mid-20s, and Carolina would be implied in the upper teens, like 18, 19, something like that. So that's how Vegas sees it. I do see on the just like with how the markets are functioning in this game, a vast majority of the money is coming down on the Falcons, but a vast majority of the actual bets are coming down on the Panthers. I don't really know as much about betting markets in terms of what that actually means, but I just thought it was interesting to point out. They're almost like inverse, so I thought that was interesting. And it's also worth mentioning that this is going to be the Panthers' home opener. They've started the season on the road, back-to-back games, and so I would imagine that that's going to make this environment probably a little bit, greater than it typically might be for the Panthers, at least in past years. It's one of the games that I have tended to travel to because it's obviously just in driving distance. You can even make it a day trip, which I know some of you guys who are watching the podcast, I know a lot of Falcons fans will be doing that on Sunday, especially for a 1 o'clock kickoff. That makes a lot of sense. It's very doable. But it's not typically when I've been to these games, and I'm not going this week, but when I've been to these games, it's kind of a tough atmosphere to play in just because it's so kind of muted, I hate to put it that bluntly for them, but it kind of feels, it's not even like a college game, because like a college game, you still have a lot of pageantry and excitement, at least if we're talking about, some of the higher level college games. You've got student sections making lots of noise and stuff, and it's just not that way for the Panthers. So when I've been there, at least, it feels kind of corporate. It feels just kind of muted. Obviously, some cheers when the Panthers do good things, but even like some cheers. Like that's the way I would describe, as opposed to like roars or like getting super loud or like it being deafening on third, like that. That's not the environment there. So, but having said that it could not be that way this week. It could be, a much louder environment. And obviously the Falcons have their fair share of poor performances there in Carolina. So definitely not one to look over, even though the Panthers have not a lot going for them in this game, and let's kind of break it down. Usually we start with the offense just because that's how my mind naturally works, but let's flip it around. Start with how Atlanta's defense is going to match up against this Panthers offense. Again, led by Bryce Young, who's gotten off to a pretty rough start. Really, his only good stretch of the season so far has been in garbage time in week 2 against the Arizona Cardinals, where the team was able to come back and make that game respectable. And, to be fair to them, they had a chance to win it on the last drive. They had a chance to go down the field and score. Having said that, the Cardinals were without, at that point, they lost, I believe, 2 defensive backs in that game, so they were starting to struggle there towards the end. Otherwise, the Panthers haven't really done much on offense. They lost 26-10 at home to a Jacksonville Jaguars team that we don't think is anything all that great. And, so I think that this sets up pretty well for this Falcons defense, especially considering the fact that the Panthers are going to be without their starting guard and center this week, who they both put on IR. That's noteworthy, not just because it's obviously more difficult to play when you don't have your starting guard and center who you're relying on to start the season, but I think it's particularly difficult for the Panthers in this game because it's your first game going without these guys. And y'all know how it is. Like when, Elijah Wilkinson is starting his first game, you don't know how it's going to go. There might be some mistakes that those backups make, when they're first stepping in, and maybe they kind of get more comfortable as they go and they get more time together. Obviously, if these guys are going on IR, the new Garden Center are going to be getting plenty of time to work together over the coming weeks. But this particular week, they probably, I guess they've probably worked together on practice squad and in practice and things like that leading up to the season. But still, I would think that this sets up very, very well for a Falcons front that we talked about earlier this week that's just looking really good, really physical, really dynamic and aggressive. They've got that youthful spirit about them, and, they are young with players like Zach Harrison still early in his career, and then Brandon Dorlus and Ruka Roro still just in their second years. And I think it's worth noting that David Onyemata, who is the seasoned veteran now, kind of replacing Grady Jarrett as that elder statesman in that room, I think he's looked really, really good so far this season, just physically, just the way he's moving around, getting after it. The heavy hands are there. He's also just moving up and down the line, horizontally, kind of down the line of scrimmage well to close gaps. So really, really good from him, and I think that just makes it a bit of a nightmare for this Carolina offensive line. That is probably, if this game plays out the way I think we expect it, for the Falcons to have a lead, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the other side of the ball, but if the Falcons have a lead in this game, then they're going to be set up to play exactly how Jeff Ulbrich and Raheem Morris kind of have talked about how they built this defense, which is to play with leads and then to get after the quarterback and really kind of stamp their authority on these games. And for that reason, what we talked about, maybe the Falcons defense and what they've shown statistically so far is not exactly what they'll prove to be by the end of the season. I think it could very well continue in this game with keeping up the amount of pressures, sacks. I really feel like this could be, you hate to just predict it's going to be a field day for a defense in terms of getting to the quarterback and having all these kind of, impact splash plays on defense, but I really think it could be. And not just getting to the quarterback, but, Bryce Young is a guy who has not shown that he's super comfortable in that pocket, especially in being able to see over his offensive line. So he could be wanting to get out of there. That could put him in some trouble. Could also play to his benefit. But I say that it could play to his trouble because we saw J.J. McCarthy in that game in week 2 surely have a plan to move around a little bit, get himself out of the pocket, use his legs that he's known for, and the Falcons were able to keep him hemmed in for the most part. I can only think of one real rush that he had where he really got out of the pocket and gained significant yards, and Bryce Young isn't even necessarily a runner in the way that I think J.J. McCarthy is at this point in his career. So I think it's a game where the Falcons can not just get to Bryce Young, but I think there's every opportunity for them to create turnovers, either when they get there with strip sacks and forcing fumbles and whatnot, or just, forcing him into some errant throws, bad throws under pressure that could lead to interceptions potentially. And we'll see how that plays out. It is worth noting on the interceptions front, the coverage matchups for this team, it'll be very interesting to see how the Falcons play in the secondary without A.J. Terrell. I think we can expect him at this point not to play. Went down with what looked to be a pretty serious hamstring injury, was ruled out of that week 2 game relatively quickly after succumbing to that injury late in the second quarter. And there's a slew of options. I asked Raheem Morris about this earlier this week of who was going to be the corner that would step up and play, and whether he had someone in mind already that he knew was going to kind of be that backup. And he said no, there was going to be a competition. So he mentioned guys like Natrone Brooks. I'm not saying this in any order, but D. Alford, Clark Phillips. But then he also mentioned C.J. Henderson from the practice squad, who that is a name that I think is maybe most likely actually out of any of these guys to play a bunch of snaps in place of A.J. Terrell this week, particularly because of the size. And when you look at the players that are on the other side of that football, on the other side of that line of scrimmage for the Panthers, especially I'm thinking of their first-round pick, Tedorona McMillan. He's a big physical receiver. He's been often compared to a Drake London type of receiver, and C.J. Henderson probably has the size profile to best match up with a player like him. So that's one I would look out for. And it'll be interesting because they're without AJ to see how much man coverage they play in this game because they've been a very heavy man-to-man team so far through 2 games this year. And I think that has helped them in terms of giving them time to get to the quarterback. We talked in week 1 about how I saw Baker Mayfield kind of dropping back and just patting that football a lot more in the pocket than we were used to seeing last year when the team was playing so much like matchy zone coverage where they're playing off these receivers, and so often quarterbacks were able to just get the ball out quick. I don't think they're going to want to give Bryce Young, with all these disadvantages that the Panthers have in this game with regards to the offensive line, etc. They're not going to want to give him those easy outs. So I would still expect quite a bit of man coverage, quite a bit of just tighter coverage closer to the line of scrimmage, and hopefully the Falcons can get home. Or Ulbrich will be hoping that his Falcons defensive linemen can get home, and they certainly seem, on their part, the Falcons front, they seem healthy, eager to get after it. Talked to a bunch of them this week. Great vibes, of course. So I think things set up really well for this Atlanta defense. And when we go back to look at that implied score on the spread, 18, 19 points for Carolina. If it's me, I feel like they're probably pretty happy if they get there, just considering what they're dealing with on that offensive side of the football. In addition to basically what they've shown so far this season, which is, guys like Xavier Legette just not really living up to expectations so far. Obviously, Bryce Young kind of not living up to expectations as, where he was drafted overall in his career to this point, and especially this season after, playing pretty well toward very well, I should say, down the stretch of last season. So they just seem to be sputtering, and I'm sure at some point they'll kind of get out of their funk a little bit, and who knows, maybe that home field advantage in their home opener could help them in that respect. But I certainly think that this one sets up very, very well for Atlanta's defense, and probably one of the reasons why they are 5.5-point favorites in this game. Now, moving on to the other side of the football, the Falcons offense. I think the big question mark for the team at this point is, are they able to get that passing game going the way that I think they want to see it, the way that we all expected to see it before the season? That has just not really come to fruition yet at this point, despite the fact that Michael Penix threw for 298 yards in that opening game. 50 of those yards came on the third play, which was a check down. Michael Penix still has not completed a pass to a target that's more than 15 yards downfield, which is a trend around the NFL, I should say. It's not just the Falcons that are dealing with this kind of thing. Teams overall are just kind of going more towards that too high safety look. And based on what Zach Robinson said this week, if that's the case, if the Panthers kind of stick to that, which I do kind of think is what's going to happen, I feel like the Panthers would rather make the Falcons, quote unquote, earn it, so to speak, than just kind of like take chances and leave themselves a little bit exposed down the field. Then I think the Falcons will just run the ball with Bijan Robinson. And if the Falcons run it like they did, I shouldn't say just with Bijan. Obviously, Tyler Algier is a key component to this too, because he can pick up some chunks even when Bijan gets a blow on the sidelines and keep that thing moving. And if the Falcons are able to do that, like they did against Minnesota, maybe there's just not that much of a need for Michael Penix to really open things up and push the ball downfield. I just do think that for the Falcons to continue to, as Zach Robinson says, build this thing, you do want to have those moments, those successful moments, and again, proving it to yourself and proving it to the opponent that you've got this kind of tool or club in your bag, so to speak. So we'll see if they can get that working for them. They're, pretty healthy across that offensive line. One place they're not so healthy is at the tight end position. Kyle Pitts was added to the injury report on Thursday. We'll get an update on Friday. I'm recording this before we get that. Charlie Warner has not practiced yet this week. That is not a good sign for him or the Falcons. I would lean toward the fact that he's not going to play in this game on Sunday, based upon the fact that he has not played. Again, we will see what the update is on him later on Friday, whether he is able to play any part in practice. If he is, then I would say that maybe there's a chance he could play. If not, Tegan Quitoriano, I don't know if I'll get that name right ever. But I would expect him to step up and kind of be the replacement for Charlie Warner as that blocking back. But he's not going to be able to do as good of a job as Warner can do. That's just like Warner's specialty. Warner is one of the best in the NFL at doing what he does, especially with all the motions and the way that Zach Robinson likes to utilize him as a chess piece, which we really saw against Minnesota as kind of more of an H-back than he's ever been. Tegan Cotoriano will have a lot on his plate in that respect to help get the Falcons' run game going. And I thought that Warner was very instrumental part in getting the Falcons' run game going, in addition to the backs, of course, and what they showed in that game. And if he's not able to play, maybe it means more 11 personnel, back to the 11 personnel looks that we saw last year from the Falcons. We've obviously talked a lot this week about Zach Robinson playing a lot more 12 personnel, especially in that Minnesota game where they played it 87% of the time. If Warner's not playing, you're not going to see 87% 12 personnel. It just doesn't make sense. And Zach Robinson has said the reason why they've played that is because that's the way they get their 11 best players on the field, which I think is interesting. That's just how much they value Charlie Warner and the way that he impacts the run game and just the way that they want to play in general. So I'll be kind of interested if Warner doesn't play, just so we can see what that would look like. It gives us more of an insight into how the coaches are thinking about how they want to make the offense work. I think if there's a weakness for, by the way, I should add Carolina also could be without an outside linebacker and a defensive lineman, potentially even two defensive linemen in this game who have not been practicing. Those players, let's see if I got the injury report up. Those players are Patrick Jones is the outside linebacker who has not practiced on Wednesday and Thursday, and then Tershawn Wharton, a defensive tackle for them, also has not practiced. Both those players with hamstrings, and so if you got a hamstring injury and you're not practicing on Wednesday or Thursday, I would say you're probably not playing. And then there was one other. Bobby Brown was another defensive tackle added to the injury report on Thursday. Practiced in full on Wednesday, but then added as a DNP on Thursday with a knee. So we'll keep an update on him to see if he plays. So that's good for the Falcons offense, but I would say the weakness for them is kind of the weakness that's always been for the Falcons when they play against the Carolina Panthers, and that's Derek Brown on the inside. But I think the reason why specifically he could be dangerous for the Falcons this week is because I think there's a little bit of a weakness on this Falcons offensive line. It's not where we thought it was going to be necessarily. I think we thought it was going to be at that right tackle position where the team was looking for someone to replace Caleb McGarry. But in my opinion, it's actually been at that left guard spot, Matthew Bergeron. I just thought that he just has not been very good. And I think he can be good. He's shown flashes, just a little bit inconsistent. And it's just, it's not like an every play thing. He's bad. He's a liability. But there are just these moments where, he it's not necessarily that he gets beat, honestly, to me. It's more of he's just doesn't execute correctly, especially in pass protection. And especially on stunts, basically. And we saw Penix be the victim of that at least once in Minnesota, where Bergeron should have been passing off a stunting player who was aligned over him at the snap to Jake Matthews, whose end had looped around, and Bergeron just goes right with him, and that looper comes right down the middle and gets right to Penix, pretty much untouched. And you can't do that. And it just makes me worry that the Panthers are going to be able to execute some similar stunts and get home in some similar ways, and Derek Brown is going to be a big part of that. And Derek Brown is also a good enough defensive lineman just to beat a player like Matthew Bergeron straight up one-on-one. Not every play, again, but on certain plays. And I would imagine that if the Panthers, when they're breaking down the tape and what they've seen from this Falcons offensive line, they're not going to want to put Derek Brown on the other side of the football next to Chris Lindstrom. That would be a waste because Chris Lindstrom will take care of that situation. They're going to want to match him up against Matthew Bergeron, and the Falcons are going to have to be prepared for that and being able to protect Michael Penix and to get this running game continuing to pick up those positive chunks on play down to down. So that's the breakdown for this team. I'm looking forward to see how it goes. I do think ultimately, my prediction would be that the Falcons win this one and win it comfortably, honestly. I think we could see a true blowout in this game. I think that when you just look at the matchups, it sets up that way with the injuries. that each teams are dealing with. Again, the Falcons have their share of injuries as well. I just don't see them as being as impactful. I think that they can get around some of the injuries they have, like to a Charlie Warner. Then, I'm just looking at that guard center combo. Like, think about it, the Falcons were missing their starting center and guard in a game for the first time. You're going into your first game after having put in these players on IR. That would be tough to deal with. And I think the Falcons will be able to take advantage of that. So we'll see what happens. Again, you can tune in to 92.9 The Game all morning, afternoon to listen to the game if you're in your car or wherever. If you're even just watching on your TV, just turn on the Odyssey app while you're watching TV. You can listen to Wes and Dave. Then we'll have all the post-game coverage for you, too, on 92.9 The Game. Thank you guys so much for listening this week. You can hear me, if you want to hear me one more time before this game, I'll be on Wade Ford Tailgate Show Sunday morning. Starts at 9 a.m. bright and early. So if you're on your way to church or you're getting coffee in the morning or wherever, just flip us on 92.9 The Game or on the Odyssey app, and we'll talk to you then.